What if the most powerful military outpost Russia ever built is now slowly dying? Not from enemy fire, but from Putin's own decisions. What if the fortress he once used to threaten all of Europe has quietly become a trap he cannot escape? That is exactly what is happening in Kaliningrad right now, and the world has barely noticed. If this kind of deep geopolitical analysis is what you want more of, hit that like button right now, subscribe so you never miss a video, and share this with someone who needs to understand what is really happening in Europe. It takes 2 seconds, and it helps more than you know. Kaliningrad is a strange place on the map. It sits on the Baltic Sea, completely cut off from the Russian mainland. It shares no land border with Russia itself. Instead, it is surrounded by Lithuania to the north and east and Poland to the south. To reach it by land from Russia, you have to pass through foreign territory. That has always made it both a strategic prize and a potential vulnerability. For decades, Russia treated it as a prize. Today, it is becoming a vulnerability in ways that would have seemed impossible just 5 years ago. To understand how we got here, you need to go back a little. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union took control of what was then the German city of Königsberg and renamed it Kaliningrad. The Germans were expelled, Soviet citizens moved in. Over the following decades, Russia packed this small territory with military hardware, missiles, warships, air defense systems, and tens of thousands of soldiers. It threatened Poland, it threatened the Baltic states, it threatened the entire northern edge of the alliance. Then came February 2022, and Putin made a decision that changed everything. He chose to go all in on Ukraine, and to fuel that war machine, he started pulling forces from places that were never meant to be emptied. The Leningrad military district near the Finnish border was stripped. Garrisons near St. Petersburg were hollowed out. The 11th Army Corps was the backbone of Kaliningrad's defense. 12,000 troops, built over 6 years specifically for one job, protecting this enclave against any threat from NATO's eastern members. That entire force was ripped out and thrown into the grinding war in Ukraine's east. What remained in Kaliningrad was a skeleton crew, not enough to defend the territory, not enough to launch any serious operation, just enough to keep the lights on in the barracks. Finnish intelligence confirmed what satellite imagery was already showing. The bases near Russia's border with Finland were essentially empty. 80% of equipment and personnel had vanished. In some locations, only 1 in 5 soldiers remained, in others, even fewer. Finnish officials made the point bluntly. Russia had been warning NATO countries about its military power for years. Britain's intelligence services added another striking detail. Russia had removed some of its S-400 air defense systems from Kaliningrad and sent them east to replace losses suffered in combat. The S-400 was not just a defensive tool. With a range of roughly 400 kilometers, it had the ability to monitor and threaten airspace over Lithuania and parts of Poland. British intelligence described it clearly. The willingness to accept this level of risk in Kaliningrad shows just how stretched Russia has become. The war in Ukraine is consuming its most modern capabilities faster than they can be replaced. And it was not just air defense that went. The 336th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade, Kaliningrad's heaviest mechanized unit, was also sent to Ukraine. According to military analysts, that unit has been so badly depleted that rebuilding it to its former strength will take years, possibly longer. Putin did not just send Kaliningrad's soldiers to war. He sent its entire defensive identity. Russia saw the problem forming and tried to respond. In 2024, a new military corps was established in the Republic of Karelia, near the Finnish border. Construction began on renovated garrisons, new barracks, training grounds, and vehicle depots. On paper, it looked like a serious rebuild. A new force of up to 15,000 troops to fill the void left by the departing units. But on the ground, the reality told a different story. Most of the soldiers assigned to this new corps were already fighting in Ukraine, including in the Kursk region, where Russian forces had been scrambling to respond to a Ukrainian incursion. The construction sites existed, but they were still construction sites. Buildings were at foundation level. Bases were being built while the men meant to fill them were bleeding into foreign soil hundreds of kilometers away. Russia was trying to patch the hole in its western defenses while simultaneously tearing new holes with every unit it diverted to the Ukrainian front. Every solution created a new problem. Every replacement force was pulled away before it could take root. And then the consequences stopped being abstract. On May 20th, 2026, satellite imagery revealed new construction at Kaliningrad's most critical airbase. 4 protective aircraft shelters were being built at the Chkalovsk Naval Aviation Base, just a few kilometers from the city center. This base houses Russian fighter jets, including Su-30SM and Su-24M aircraft. With the S-400 umbrella reduced, these planes were suddenly more exposed than at any point in recent memory. Russia knew it. The shelters were an admission written in steel and concrete. But analysts pointed out something uncomfortable. The shelters were built using profiled metal sheeting. They would offer some protection against drone strikes. Against a real coordinated military attack, they would be nearly useless. Russia was building psychological reassurance, not actual security. 5 days later, that concern became real in a way no one in Moscow wanted. On May 25, 2026, Kaliningrad's Krabrovo airport was shut down for the first time since the war began. Civilian aircraft circled above, unable to land. Russia's emergency warning system issued a UAV threat alert for the region. Emergency aviation procedures were activated. The shutdown lasted roughly 90 minutes. Russian authorities reported no explosions and no confirmed damage. They also did not explain where the drones came from or who sent them, but the implication was impossible to ignore. Ukraine has been steadily expanding the range and sophistication of its drone program for years. It has struck targets deep inside Russian territory, well beyond Moscow. If the drones over Kaliningrad were Ukrainian, it means the enclave is no longer just politically isolated, it is militarily within reach. The fortress that once sent threatening signals across NATO territory was now scrambling to protect its own airspace from unmanned aircraft. Take a second right now. If you have made it this far, this video is clearly something you value. So do something about it. Drop a comment below with one word that describes Putin's situation in Kaliningrad, just one word. And while you're at it, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who care about understanding the real world. Poland was watching all of this unfold, and Warsaw did not sit still. The response came in layers, each one more significant than the last. First, Poland moved to cut off Russia's intelligence eyes. Between 2024 and 2025, Polish authorities systematically shut down Russian consulates across the country. Poznań, Krakow, and finally Gdansk in December 2025. These were not ordinary diplomatic offices. The Gdansk consulate had spent years quietly monitoring NATO naval activity in the Baltic Sea. Its rooftop equipment tracked ship movements, port operations, and radio communications. The Poznań office had served as a node for observing NATO exercises and tracking military logistics through western Poland. With their closure, Kaliningrad's garrison lost its ground-level intelligence network on the western side of its border. A military operating blind cannot plan effectively. And a military operating blind that is also understaffed is something far worse than vulnerable. Then came the physical response. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk described the Eastern Shield project as the largest fortification effort on Poland's eastern border since the Second World War. Construction began in January 2026 with a budget of $2.5 billion. The plan calls for a 3-layered defensive line stretching along 700 kilometers of border. Anti-tank trenches 4 meters deep, 6 rows of concrete dragon's teeth barriers, camouflaged bunkers, infrastructure for rapid mine deployment. The goal was to have 38% of the border fortified by the end of 2026. Before those fortifications were even halfway complete, the commercial border was already being choked off. Poland shut down 2 major border crossings into Kaliningrad in January 2026. The crossings that technically remained open were barely functional, with queues stretching to 12 hours and only a handful of vehicles passing per hour. Insurance companies classified the Kaliningrad transit route as a war zone risk and refused to cover vehicles using it. In practice, the border was closed. 18,000 truck drivers in the region lost their livelihoods. The southern land corridor into Kaliningrad was sealed. The eastern corridor had been under pressure even longer. For decades, Kaliningrad breathed through a single railway line running through Lithuania and connecting the enclave to the Russian mainland. Everything came through that line. Fuel, food, construction materials, military equipment. It was the circulatory system keeping 1 million people and a significant military garrison alive. Lithuania tested what happened when that line was squeezed back in 2022, restricting the transit of goods under EU sanctions. Kaliningrad's governor described the potential loss as catastrophic. Moscow threatened serious consequences. Lithuania did not blink, because behind Lithuania stood NATO's collective defense guarantee. The threats rang hollow. Russia was already committed in Ukraine and could not credibly open another front. Then, in late 2025, a bizarre incident added new pressure on the eastern route. Smuggling balloons, carrying contraband cigarettes launched from Belarus, drifted into Lithuanian airspace and forced the closure of Vilnius airport. Lithuania classified it as a deliberate hybrid attack and closed border crossings with Belarus. The ripple effect reached Kaliningrad's fuel supply. Lithuanian railways, citing sanctions against Russian oil companies, halted the transit of petroleum products to the enclave. After a brief transition period, the cutoff became total. In 2024, nearly 371,000 tons of petroleum products had traveled that railway. Almost all of it belonged to a single Russian oil company. Now the flow was zero. That was not just civilian fuel. The Baltic Fleet and Iskander missile systems stationed in Kaliningrad depend on the same supply chains. Putin's most powerful geopolitical lever in the region was quietly neutralizing itself. And there is a longer-term threat that goes beyond sanctions and political decisions. The Baltic states are planning to tear up the old Soviet-era wide-gauge railway tracks and replace them with European standard rails as part of the Rail Baltica project, which aims to connect Tallinn to Warsaw by 2030. When that happens, it will not be a political decision keeping Russian trains out of Kaliningrad. It will be physics. The trains will simply not fit the tracks. The eastern gate will be permanently sealed in steel and concrete. The energy situation tells an equally dire story. For decades, Kaliningrad ran on electricity from the Brel grid, a Soviet-era shared network connecting Belarus, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The shared frequency of a large network provides stability. When one part of the system falters, the rest compensates. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have now completed their transition away from that grid and joined Europe's continental power network. Kaliningrad was left behind. It is now an energy island, generating its own power and managing its own balance, with no external buffer to catch it if something fails. Russia's solution was a floating LNG terminal. Moscow declared it would generate its own electricity and be self-sufficient. But self-sufficiency in energy is far more complicated than it sounds. Without connection to a larger grid, a single equipment failure can cascade into a blackout affecting hospitals, water systems, and heating simultaneously. LNG delivered by ship costs exponentially more than pipeline gas, and that cost lands on the bills of residents and businesses already struggling. In November 2025, the Baltic Sea froze earlier than expected, and ice made delivery difficult. Only 2 tanker shipments got through during a critical period, each one sustaining the region for just 12 days. The energy security plan had turned into a gamble against the weather. One gas pipeline still ran from Russia through Belarus and Lithuania into Kaliningrad. The transit agreement governing it expired at the end of 2025. Lithuania agreed to renew it, but at nearly triple the previous price. Annual transit revenue jumped from 1 million euros to 30 million. The message from Vilnius was understated but unmistakable. The valve controlling the gas that keeps Kaliningrad warm in winter sits in Lithuanian hands, and the new agreement runs only until 2030, with no guarantee of renewal. The human cost of all this is not found in strategy papers. It is found in the lives of the people actually living in Kaliningrad. The Avtotor factory, once the most modern automobile assembly plant in Russia, sat nearly idle. It had assembled vehicles for BMW and Hyundai. Sanctions severed the supply chains from Western manufacturers, and no Russian replacement was available. The production lines went quiet. Shipping goods to and from Kaliningrad by sea cost 6 times more than land transport, and locals have started calling it the enclave tax. A bag of cement cost 3 times what it did before 2022. Regional inflation climbed above 10%, outpacing the already strained Russian national average. A third of local entrepreneurs said they were planning to close their businesses. People are leaving. Estimates suggest between 100,000 and 150,000 residents have left Kaliningrad since 2022. That is up to 15% of the entire population, but these are not random departures. The people leaving are engineers, doctors, and technology professionals in their 30s and 40s. The working age core of a functioning society is walking out the door. Even migrant workers from Central Asia who had come to Kaliningrad looking for economic opportunity are returning home, saying there is simply nothing left to earn there. This is not an ordinary economic downturn. It is a slow unraveling. And yet Russia cannot walk away. Kaliningrad carries too much historical and symbolic weight. It is tied to the Soviet victory in the Second World War, a narrative Putin has built his entire political identity around. Strategically, it gives Russia an ice-free port on the Baltic Sea and a forward military position pressed against NATO's eastern frontier. To surrender it, even symbolically, would require an explanation Putin cannot give to his domestic audience. So the Iskander missiles remain, the Baltic fleet still operates, electronic warfare systems continue to run, but the credibility behind all of it has been hollowed out. Russia threatened serious consequences when Lithuania restricted transit in 2022. Lithuania stood firm. Russia called NATO exercises rehearsals for aggression against Kaliningrad in 2026. NATO kept exercising. Each warning carried less weight than the one before because everyone, in Warsaw, in Vilnius, in Brussels, and Washington, could see the same satellite images showing empty bases and unfinished construction sites. An army exhausted by 3 years of attritional war in Ukraine cannot credibly open a second front in the Baltic. The bluffs are running out. The sea route remains, but it cannot fill the gap. Ferry traffic has increased, but sea transport costs 4 times more than road. Ships are slow. Ports can only handle so much volume. In winter, ice and storms can shut the route entirely. The Baltic Sea itself has become more hostile to Russian logistics since Finland and Sweden joined NATO, completing what analysts now call a NATO lake, a body of water where Russia's movements are monitored and its options are constrained. There is a principle at the heart of real strategic power. It is not about how loudly you can threaten. It is about what you can actually sustain over time. Kaliningrad was once Russia's most expensive trump card against NATO. It was a place that forced European planners to think carefully, to hedge, to worry. Today, it is a city that cannot reliably import cement, where the airport shuts down because of mystery drones, where the population is shrinking faster than the army can be rebuilt, and where every lifeline runs through hands that no longer fear the threats coming from Moscow. Putin built a fortress. Then he dismantled it to fight a war he expected to win in days. Now he owns neither the fortress nor the victory. What he owns is a burden that grows heavier every month. A city he must feed, but increasingly cannot, must defend, but visibly isn't, cannot abandon without political collapse, and cannot hold without costs that keep rising. Kaliningrad was the symbol of Russian power in Europe's west. It is becoming the symbol of something else entirely. What happens when a country overestimates its strength, bets everything on a single gamble, and slowly runs out of room to maneuver? The fortress has not fallen, but it is no longer a fortress. It is a pressure point, and the pressure is coming from every direction at once. You just sat through nearly 4,000 words on one of the most underreported stories in global geopolitics right now, and that tells me something about you. You think carefully. You want the real picture, not the headline. So here is one last thing to do before you leave. Share this video with one person who you think would actually care about this. Not to go viral, just because this kind of information matters and too few people are paying attention. Subscribe if you haven't already. And come back, because this story is far from over.